the election was decided based on how people felt about wokeness. I think that now that the pendulum has swung, like, we're past wokeness.
In this video, we watch Andrew Schulz's recent appearance on Fox News. Andrew Schulz primarily discusses the embarrassment that was the Democrats' strategy in the 2024 presidential election. With that, let's watch Andrew Schulz join everyone else in piling on the Democrats.
In a lot of ways, the election was decided based on how people felt about wokeness. I think that now that the pendulum has swung, like, we're past wokeness. Like, wokeness is done. We've moved on. The country has spoken loud and clear. Unanimous victory for Trump. He ran on anti-woke. The most successful ad was, Trump is for me and you. Kamala is for they, them. Like, the most successful ad was vote against wokeness, right? That played during the Super Bowl. So in a lot of ways, the election was decided based on how people felt about wokeness. And they were like, we're going too far in that direction. So now that that's been solved, we don't need to argue about it anymore. Like, we already know how America feels. You can say whatever you want about wokeness. Like, you can be critical of it because nobody's going to give you pushback because the majority of the country said we don't believe in that anymore. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't want progress. Like, I'll be honest, it's harder for Democrats. They're the party of progress. It's easy to go, let's go back this way. Pushing things forward is hard because you're disrupting people's way of life. Pulling things back is easy because you're bringing their way of life back, right? So I empathize with Democrats. It's like, I empathize with the intention of wanting to make life easier for everybody. I think that that's a noble intention. And the question is, how can you push progress forward without making me feel any sort of like restriction in my life or making me feel any sort of guilt for what I believe to be quite normal or sensical? And that's a tricky task, but it's up to them to figure it out.
Well, Andrew definitely hit the nail on the head that the vast majority of the American people did in a lot of ways vote against wokeness. But he is very naive to think wokeness is over and there's no need to rail against it anymore. Because the folks who were passionate about it, truly passionate about it, even though it's a small minority, it's a loud minority, and they will not shut up about it. We have to stay vigilant. I think that's a really complacent attitude to have, to say, oh, wokeness is dead. Not to mention some of the more popular left-wing streamers like Sam Cedar and Emma Vigeland and that girl, Francesca Fiorentini, come to mind as people that will die on the hill of men can be women and women can be men and every crazy far left thing you can think of. So there's clearly an audience for that crap. I also think we really need to be careful about Democrats feigning that they are done with wokeness. I've been wanting to mention this, but Gavin Newsom, as if he doesn't have his hands full attempting to run the state of California, which he's done horribly, he started a podcast. And he's had on prominent right-wing people, Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, and they sit there and they challenge him and rail against him. And he nods and smiles. And it's like, I think it's really wise because he'll agree with them on saying like wokeness has gone too far and stuff like that. Because what I think he's trying to do is say, see, I can get along with everyone. And while he's always been super far left wing and run California into the ground, he's got the slick back hair and a good smile. And it appears like, oh, he's coming around. But his actions would suggest much differently. So he's trying to create an appearance that he's moved more center, and that's just not the case. So we can't let our guard down against this stuff because him doing this podcast and having right wingers on and appearing to get along with them and find common ground, which they don't. I mean, he'll straight up lie and just tell people what he thinks they want to hear. You know, when wokeness was popular, he was all about it. Now that he knows it's dying, he's going to tell everyone what he thinks they want to hear, which is, yeah, I was never in favor of all that stuff. And this is ridiculous or that's ridiculous. I mean, he really doesn't give much pushback against these conservatives on his podcast. But I have done nothing in these videos but rail against the Democrats for how stupid they are for the things they choose to embrace. And if there was ever a move that I thought was smart, it's what Gavin Newsom is doing. He's pretending. He knows that some people will buy this image change he's trying to create this image change he's trying to cultivate and say, oh, well, he seems like a nice guy. And, you know, he's not being real combative with these people from the right wing. So maybe he's not that bad, because the move cycle moves so quickly. You forget about everything that he's done so horribly in California. I mean, they tried to recall him. We could have had Larry Elder as the governor out there and turn things around. But of course, the Democrat lemmings of California couldn't let that happen. But I think he is an evil, evil person. And I'm sure there are people on the right wing that are evil, but he stands out to me and terrifies me because he's a good politician. And clearly this image change that he's trying to portray is all to set himself up for a run in the next presidential election. I haven't heard that from anywhere. Just think it's obvious from what he's doing. Anyway, since that was a short clip, I've got another clip for you here of Andrew Schulz talking about when Donald Trump came onto his podcast and his motivations for doing the interview. Let's take a look.
What am I doing?
And I mean, I think for people that follow your podcast and all your content and stuff, it was also probably a left turn because it's not political in any way, this special at all.
Yeah. Not really.
Yeah.
No.
So I mean, given the year that you had, like wrapping up last year into this year, it's like you've already had, I think, a bigger year than like most comedians. You've interviewed the president.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you because comedy seemed to play a pretty fair major role in the outcome of this election.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about it because
some people think.
I mean, I wanted to know what you think. Do you think comedy helped get Trump elected?
That's interesting. Did comedy do it? You mean by like going on the podcast?
Yeah, by podcast. I mean, he went on several, obviously Rogan and Theo and you.
I have a maybe more humble take than some.
Okay.
Which is, I don't think we influenced the election at all. I think people were going to vote this way no matter what. And I think seeing him on certain podcasts made them feel more comfortable voicing how they were already going to vote.
Oh, okay.
Like I don't think very many people were like watching, Trump on mine or Rogan or Theo, and then they flipped on him 100%. That's just me. I don't know if we have that kind of power.
Yeah.
But what it might do is make you feel more confident publicly sharing how you feel about Trump, right? Because maybe in those situations he feels a little less radioactive.
Yeah.
Well,
I also think it's interesting because even though your fans go across generations and stuff, there's a lot of younger people that follow you that probably weren't as engaged in any election talk or politics, but like comedy maybe offers an entry point into that. Yeah. Podcasting. Do you think about that? Like, the influence that you have in terms of bringing people to.
I think, for me, I don't really care about.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
Politics. I just care about culture, but sometimes politics is the reflection of culture. Yeah. So that's when I start to kind of key in on it. Like if people are really caring about something, that's important to me. And then every 4 years they really start to care.
Right. And
then they'll move away and they will pop up and down the next 2.5, 3. And then we'll go through this shit again. It's like now we're the pendulum has swung the other way. So we're out of like the censorship era, Before that, maybe we were in the censorship era. And then comedians are usually the first ones to complain about it because it kind of affects the way that we do our thing. And that's happened throughout history. And usually you get like really prolific comedians that come out of these times where there's a lot of censorship. And they write these great bits about it, Carlin being one of them. Even Eddie, like people in Pryor, the way that they would talk about them were like, I can't believe they're saying these things. Like, this is crazy. So I think the censorship in a way is kind of like good for comedy, but comedians speak about it. And then comedy having a boom, and that's a reflection.
I'm curious what you guys think, but I think Donald Trump sitting down with these podcasters absolutely had a major effect on how people perceive Donald Trump because he came across as so authentic, especially when I think about Joe Rogan. The guy was there for 3 hours. I don't know if they used the bathroom. He just talked off the cuff for 3 hours. I don't think I could do that personally. But then you'd see Kamala Harris and everything was so obviously scripted. And anyone who didn't see that, it still blows my mind that anyone thought she would be a good leader of the free world. But Andrew doesn't agree with that. But he also said that he thinks people that were already going to vote for Donald Trump, that had historically been kind of quiet about it because they didn't want to be publicly shamed, like in 2016 or 2020. I definitely think him going on these podcasts did make people feel more comfortable saying, yeah, I support Donald Trump, because it was hard to get people to admit it in 2016 and 2020. And then I felt like in 2024, people were like, screw this. I'm going to tell everyone exactly how I feel. And I think that's actually one thing the left did good with the media. The media made Donald Trump look like such a crazy person that it made people almost ashamed or embarrassed to say that they voted for Donald Trump. And then they got people so angry about this image they'd created for Donald Trump of what he really was, that it made the other side, people that were crazy on the left, want to get in fights with people for wearing a Trump hat and stuff like that. Remember, that was like all too common. There were like teachers banning kids from wearing a Trump hat, stuff like that. So I think the comedy and podcasting world had a very positive effect on Trump's campaign. And I guess I don't know if it changed anyone's vote, but even me, who really likes Donald Trump, I felt like you got to see a different side of him on these podcasts because it was just a conversation. There was no agenda. There was no script on Donald Trump's part. He was like, ask me what you want. Kamala wouldn't have done that in a trillion years. Anyway, let's wrap it up.
Of, the most influential person on the planet, Joe Rogan, being a comedian and loving comedians and putting comedy at the forefront, of his interests. There's also like a social media aspect in this where it's like everybody wants a funny tweet, a funny picture, a funny meme. Like people, there's like currency in being funny, Yeah. And yeah, it's just kind of like this perfect storm.
What was the hardest part about it, like prepping for that interview?
For Trump?
Yeah.
It's like calling his... For me, it was just like, I just want to understand like who he is. So I spoke to some people close to him. I spoke to Dana White for a while, and I spoke to Don Jr. for a while. I just like, tell me story. Like I want personal stories. Like tell me your relationship. Like you don't have to tell me who he is or who you think he is. Like tell me these moments that have happened between you guys, and you'll find a lot about that. The goal was like, the goal is with every person I sit down with, like, I don't want to like toot our own horn on the pod, but like, I think we got like the best interview with a lot of people specifically because we're just trying to find out who you are and make you comfortable enough to hang with us.
All right.
Yeah, I feel like fans are split on Andrew. I like him. I think some people think he's a little over the top with his laughing and slapping his buddies on the leg and stuff. Maybe not reading the room real well sometimes, but I like him. And what he described there, though, is exactly what people wanted to see out of those interviews. They didn't want to see a script. They didn't want to hear, canned stories. And I think Andrew, to his credit, that's awesome that he has a relationship enough with people like Dana White or Don Jr. He could say, tell me some cool stories about him that he can expound on, or we can, because his goal, just like I think Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, was to get to know the person, Donald Trump, not the president, not the egomaniac, not the businessman. Because if they were successful in getting to know him themselves, then the American people would get to know him too and could make their own judgment instead of one that either his campaign had tried to paint him as or as the media had been trying to paint him as. But we want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you think podcasts, comedy in general, have an effect on politics? And do you think that the sit downs that Donald Trump did on podcasts had an effect on him getting elected in 2024? Let us know in the comments. Anyway, as always, really appreciate you watching, and we will see you on the next one.